Hello and welcome to another edition of Meet the Manager. Here we chat to FPL managers who have an interesting story to tell or are offering new and different insights into the game. Today I'm joined by Daniel, aka FPL Ticker on Twitter. He has been carrying out some fascinating research into how FPL managers think and reach their decisions, which hopefully we can take to help us all improve. And in particular, how the FPL community could be the future of how people across all walks of life encounter and consume information. It's a bold statement, but we'll delve into that in a sec. Daniel, welcome. How are you?
I'm really good, thanks, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on. I've been watching these videos for years now, so to actually get to come on one is a bit of a dream come true. So thanks for letting me on.
Great stuff. So you're an academic. Let's say I've got my big boys academic glasses on today to help. And so tell us a bit about yourself and briefly about this research before we delve into that in a bit more detail, and who's been involved in that as well.
Okay. So I'm someone who works in libraries. I've been working in academic libraries now for the last 15 years or so. And something that a lot of people probably don't realise about people who work in libraries is that you're only actually a librarian once you have got a master's in library science. Oh. So I sort of decided to take the plunge a couple of years ago and do a master's in library science at City University of London. And as part of that, I had to do a dissertation. And I've been playing FPL for about 8 years now. And it just seemed like a really interesting opportunity to do my dissertation about something that's like really a real interest of mine. And I kind of noticed that the FPL community is a really interesting and sort of effective place for gathering information. And I don't think we really reflect on that too much, but when you think about the amount of information that's generated and the way people use it in the community, it's really innovative and interesting. And I wanted to explore that further, basically. So it was a small-scale research project for my master's dissertation, but it still had some interesting findings, I think. So I did an online questionnaire that was sent around. People really helpful and shared that on Twitter for me. And I also did some interviews. Mm-hmm. So I did some interviews just on Skype, and there were a small amount of people, but I interviewed people from around the world. I interviewed some content creators, but I also interviewed people who were complete casuals as well. And what I wanted to do is get a sense of where they go to find information, how they process that information, and what effect the community has on the way they play the game, basically. So yeah, that's what my research was into.
Fascinating. So this is how we met, because I was one of those content creators that you interviewed for that. And as you were asking me questions about how I think and make my decisions and about how I think the community thinks, something occurred to me that I think more people should be hearing about this. And I almost wish our chat had been recorded and put it out. So this is why I wanted to bring you on the show and to chat more about it. So I'll just put what your research is up on the screen. So it's for City University of London, and it's a study of information behaviour in the Fantasy Premier League community. So that essentially contains how we think as FPL managers, but also what perhaps not just what we can learn from other people, but what other people can learn from us, because we're the champions of getting information and making and using them to make decisions. So yeah, I mean, let's start with the early findings of your research, and it's this point here that you gave me, which is in some ways the FPL community model is the future of how people encounter information. Wow. Okay. So expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, it is a bit of a bold claim, but I think it's kind of borne out because, I should probably explain that information behaviour studies have been around for years in library science, and they started off as ways for libraries to study the users, so they could get a better sense of how do humans go out and seek information, and once you know that, you can maybe design better resources for them. That are more intuitive for people. And that's developed over the years, so that now information behaviour studies happen for all sorts of reasons. And I think the way people interact with information now is so fundamentally different to before the age of the internet, and especially social media as well. And I think you're starting to see social media communities, fan communities, maybe like the FPL community, start to perform really effectively in the way they gather information. And I think the classic case for me that kind of got me interested in this was FPL Insider, the Twitter account. I'm sure most people are familiar with that. But what FPL Insider did is it found the FPL teams of lots of Premier League footballers, coaches, things like that. And then it sort of studies them, and a bot tweets out changes that players have made. And the big case that came into the media was FPL Insider kind of found out before everyone that Jack Grealish was injured because lots of Villa players had transferred
That's
him
right,
out
I remember
of the team
that. Yeah,
season.
loads of his teammates transferred out their best player in their team, and that did raise eyebrows.
Yeah, exactly. And what was so interesting about that is that the FPL community outperformed professionals like bookmakers, really. So the FPL community knew first. So people, I think some people made some money betting against Villa or things like that. And I think that's a real example of how the FPL community collaborated to get that information. I think there was a Reddit page where people put forward the names of the players who had FPL teams. And it was basically a really effective model. And you're also starting to see this, and you do see this in other areas as well. So I was reading yesterday about some of the intelligence coming about the situation in Ukraine and how the open source intelligence community is now outperforming professional intelligence services. So your likes of your MI5 and your MI6. So this is people who are sat at home in their bedrooms in Manchester or Scotland or anywhere, and they're collaborating together to maybe geolocate where a bomb has landed and things like that. And a few years ago, that was sort of probably laughed at by intelligence services, but now it's becoming used more and more. And I think you start to see the potential power of this model, because the FPL community works as a kind of a social system, a sort of quite complex network where each individual person contributes their own skills or their own efforts, and there's a network effect. So you start to see that some people may be a journalist, some people may be a data scientist, some people can do things like ragabully and create tools that we can all use. And with everyone collaborating together, and hundreds and thousands of people collaborating together, it can be a really effective way of gathering information that can be better than a professional organization that has been...
I mean, I was going to say, an example only this week of exactly what you were talking about there has been various people within the FPL community. So, for example, James on Planet FPL. There's obviously Ben Crellin as well. There's another player who doesn't really play FPL called Ian Parrin, who's Planet Sky, Planit, Planit Sky on Twitter. He looks at scheduling around mainly the Sky game, but it's being used for FPL managers as well. There's various people like that. There's Legamane as well. There's I mean, forgive me all the ones I haven't mentioned, but there's a lot. As you can see, there's lots there. They're all pooling their information together, sharing information. Other people, I think we spoke on the Scoutcast, FPL Schofield, had then put pictorially in lists where double game weeks might be, blank game weeks, and their understanding of fixture scheduling, the broadcasters, where fixtures can go, where they can't go, it's starting to get better than not just the sports media, but the actual broadcasters and the Premier League themselves. They seem to know when the fixtures are going to in before the clubs do. Is that a good example of that?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that exactly shows how the FPL community is so successful. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I think this year we're starting to see the FPL community in general are performing really well in terms of rank. And I think that's because it's just getting better all the time, and there's more people getting involved, and everyone is kind of fine-tuning things like predicting fixtures and things like that. So I think all the time it's sort of exponentially improving. And the more people become involved, the greater the capacity of the network, really. So I think that's a great example. But you also see, things like tracking Rafinha's flight and things, and to see whether he's going to play. I mean,
Karam and his bib theory, and he's had shoe theory, and looking at training pictures. Who's wearing a bib of a different colour? Will they play? And
crucially, this is something that no professional organisation could achieve on its own. You'd have to employ like hundreds of thousands of staff to do this. So the fact that the FPL community includes so many people and they're all contributing towards it, it's something unique, really. And I think it's so effective and it's getting better all the time that I think we're likely to start seeing this in other areas of life as well. I think crucially as well, it's all facilitated by social media, right?
Yeah.
So the way Twitter works is if you have some information to put out there, you can put it out on Twitter, and if other people think that it's worthwhile or interesting, it gets reshared, it gets retweeted, it gets favorited. The person who does that gets kudos from the community, so they get more followers, they get the likes and the retweets. So there's a kind of a sort of social system going on there. There's some form of the labour of doing the primary research, and then they're rewarded by the community for that, which is a sort of virtuous circle. So
it's incentivised. Being thorough and doing research is being incentivised. And I must admit, if I see a comment saying, and I see it sometimes, particularly Let's Talk FPL Andy gets this a lot, people just simply copy his team. They don't want to do the research, they just want to copy his team. And if I see a comment like that saying, I just want to copy your team, I tend to dismiss them. But whereas as you were talking about there, those that have clearly done their research, wow, and they get their praise from me, all of us, we all praise them. So yeah, it's clearly incentivized to do research.
Yeah, it's a really good system, and I think you're starting to see other areas. So I teach in an academic library, and we're starting to see things like academic social media start to become more important. So things like academic.edu, things like programs like Mendeley that have a social media element to them. So we're starting to see that this model is maybe being pioneered in places like fan communities, things like the FPL community, but its success is starting to be used in a more professional context in other areas as well.
We're also seeing increasingly fantasy managers are meeting up in real life. So I used to meet up with fantasy managers through Fantasy Football Scout. We would meet up once a year, and it wasn't that many of us. But now there's all sorts of gatherings around the country, around the world as well. So I recently went to one in Bristol. There was about 20 or 30 of us there, and there's more, besides in London and so on. How does that link in? Because is that sort of going back to an old-fashioned way of information gathering, or is that sort of moulding into what you've been talking about, the social media side of it?
I think it feeds into the fact that it's a community, and if people have interpersonal connections as well, it just helps to build the links between people. So I was at Fantasy Football Fest, and I met a couple of people there who I was then able to interview for my project. And I think building those links between people draws more people into the community. It makes the sort of social system more concrete, more linked together. So I think it's still an internet-based community. But I think meeting up in real life just strengthens those links as well, and enables it to be stronger, really, I'd say.
Okay. You mentioned in your notes to me that you found that different types of FPL managers approach information differently, and you've got their casual stroke hardcore. So can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so there's lots of different differences between the way different types of FPL managers operate. What I found when I was doing my research is I sort of grouped people into there's 3 different types of FPL manager, roughly speaking. There are the complete casuals who maybe spend 30 minutes a week, if that. And then there are the sort of hardcore players, people who are content creators, people who are active in the community online. But there's also a big group of people who are kind of in the middle and who dip in and out of the community, maybe watch quite a lot of football, take FPL quite seriously, but don't interact so much. So they're mainly like passive in the way they consume information. They don't ever do any research themselves. They just maybe see something on Twitter and use that. So there's big differences between the amount of time these people put in. So, and I still found that even the most casual players, so I talked to one guy who he said he spends sort of 10 to 20 minutes per week on his FPL decisions, and he might do it whilst he was watching his son playing football on a Saturday morning, maybe. And I said, where do you get your information from? And he still said Twitter. He said he doesn't follow anyone on Twitter to do with fantasy football or not, but he might go onto Twitter and search for a player's name in FPL in the search bar and see what other people are saying about that. So I think people are still using the same resources. The FPL community is still a resource for a lot of casual players as well. But the difference is that the more hardcore players are more likely to be active on Twitter. They're more likely to be doing a primary research themselves. They're more likely to be sharing, and they're more likely to be interacting with other people. So I think that's a sort of quite basic difference that we're all familiar with.
Okay.
A big finding that I had that I wasn't really expecting was that people's backgrounds, the jobs they do, their educational backgrounds they have really affects the way they play FPL. So, for example, I spoke to quite a few people. I spoke to a guy who worked in banking. I think he was a commodities trader. And he was talking about how he approaches FPL as though he was making an investment in a commodity. And he talked about it in those terms. I spoke to someone else who was a data analyst, and they talked about how they analyze the data and that they use things from their work. But then I spoke to yourself, and it was interesting that you did the same, but your background is as a journalist. So you talked about things about how your background enabled you to do things like boil down information, lots of information into something that could be readily turned into a decision. You talked about things like how your background enables you to sort of look at sources and tell which sources are likely to be accurate or not. So I think it's really interesting that what your job background is does seem to affect the way you play as an FPL player.
Okay, I mean that is fascinating as well, because there'll be lots of people watching this who have those jobs that you just described and have other jobs as well, and they're probably starting to think, well, how does my job or my profession affect how I think that way? Because they might also be different in their attitudes to risk, for example, as well. It's interesting what you were saying about sort of city and business type professions. One of the first Meet the Managers we had years ago was Mark Rubenstein, who was doing exactly what you just described, was treating decisions in a similar way as he would with investments, and talking about spreading risk and those sorts of issues there. I would imagine anyone who is also, in terms of either professionally or hobby, in gambling as well, would have a very different, poker, for example, would have a very different attitude as well. You mentioned about Twitter, the role of Twitter and how people find information. But so you mentioned the sort of more casual FPL managers will look at Twitter, to get their information. But then you talk about the more hardcore managers, they use Twitter in a slightly different way, and they're perhaps a bit more involved in it as well. So, I mean, has Twitter emerged as sort of the key social media at the moment for FPL managers?
I think it has. I mean, I had trouble in my research to try and find people to take part who weren't on Twitter. So maybe there's a bit of bias involved that, you know, I'm involved in Twitter. I think the Reddit community is quite big as well, and there are some Facebook groups that are quite big. But I really do think that the FPL community seems to be based on Twitter. And yeah, it was my experience that even people who I didn't expect to talk about Twitter as a source for their FPL decision making, even they talked about Twitter, even people who don't have an FPL Twitter handle and don't follow any of the other big accounts, that they use it as well. But yeah, I think it just goes back to I think there's always been groups of people who have sort of collaborated together to find information, but I think Twitter's just made it really successful, and that the kind of architecture of Twitter has enabled it to grow massively. So things like likes and retweets. We also, so one of the interesting things that I found is that most people who I spoke to talked about the biggest problem they have is that there's too much information, and it's how to deal with how, you know, a tsunami of information. I think you described it as every week there's so much information out there. How do you sort of get all that and convert it into a decision? But Twitter allows people to do that as well. So I had a couple of people who talked about using the Twitter lists function to sort of curate their own lists of people that they want to follow, or using the likes or the favorites to collect tweets that they want to go back to when they make the decisions. So Twitter's a really useful technology because it enables the social aspect of it. It allows people to get kudos for doing the work. It allows people's good work to be spread around, but it also has tools built into it that helps us to curate that information and to sort of turn it into a decision as well. So I think Twitter's pretty crucial for FPL now.
I mean, I noticed. I mean, as a, I suppose, I guess I would be a hardcore manager in terms of the amount of time I spend with information to make my decisions. But how does the community, not just on FPL Twitter, but, you know, elsewhere, but how does the FPL community influence the decisions that we make? And I already know each week how it does with me, but and I'm sure all the listeners and viewers will. But yeah, how is that working?
Well, it was really interesting actually, and it did. When I was interviewing people, I kind of didn't find what I was expecting to find, because for me, I think it's had a massive impact on the way I play FPL, engaging with the community on Twitter. And I think we'll probably go on and look at my rank history in a while. And for me, it's not a great rank history, but you can see clearly when I started looking at content and when I didn't, because my rank started to improve. So I'm pretty, for myself, I can say that, you know, I'm pretty influenced by the stuff that I see on Twitter, the things that I see in videos and podcasts and things like that. It doesn't make my decision for me, but it really does influence the way I play the game. But what I found when I was interviewing people is people seem to be quite reticent about kind of admitting that, and that most of the people who I interviewed kind of protested that they weren't influenced at all by the stuff they see, and that they just sort of maybe watch videos for entertainment, but that it isn't influential. And I kind of doubt that. I think that if you're spending 10 hours a week watching a fantasy football YouTube content, it's probably going to have an influence on the way you play the game. And I think we can see that by things like template teams.
Yes.
If everyone wasn't being influenced by each other, I'm sure the amount of people who are buying Matt Doherty this week wouldn't be happening, right? So everyone's seen that on Twitter and had the same idea simultaneously. So yeah, that was my finding really. It was that I think it's interesting in itself that people don't want to admit that they're being influenced. People seem to want to identify as someone who makes all of their own decisions, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I know myself last week, I wildcarded, and as I had pretty much most of the players in mind, but Reece James wasn't one of them. But then whilst I was on Twitter, it was certain posters, and also on Fantasy Football Scout, looking at their the scout picks each week. So there was a combination of some trusted sources on Twitter who were content creators or managers that I think do well most seasons, plus the sources of information from the paid journalists at Fantasy Football Scout who were doing their research, and Reece James's name was mentioned, and that influenced my decision, and I did indeed get him in. Didn't captain him, but I did get him in this week. And that's me. That I was influenced by, and I've just admitted that. But you're saying, but what's interesting for you is that whenever you spoke to those people, each week there would have been a player. Each week there would have been a wave of the tsunami of information about that player, but then they're not admitting to it. Do you think that may change? Do you think? I mean, they'll have to admit to it at some point, surely. I mean, why else would people get Doherty in?
Well, I think Doherty's a great shout. Actually, I'm kind of annoyed that everyone sort of got on him. I was going to get him in anyway, but yeah, I mean. My research was only maybe a small scale research. Probably it was just a coincidence that everyone said that. But I think it's interesting, and I think also as well, it'd probably be the sort of thing you'd need to talk to someone like FPL Raptor about. But surely, if you are being influenced by it, you should be conscious of that, because if you're not conscious of it, then you can't start to examine your biases so much.
Yeah.
So I think all of us who interact on Twitter are influenced by what we see and what we see on YouTube and what we hear in podcasts. So I think it's good to be conscious of that. And it's probably good as well to start to put some sort of structure in place as well as to... I think I've heard the idea before of at the end of one game week, writing down your plans or recording your plans somewhere, so that by the end of the game week, if they've changed, you need to start to examine why.
Yes.
And if you've just been influenced by the herd mentality, I guess.
So just to timestamp this video, because these videos are aimed for people to tuck into whenever, in a year's time, 2 years' time, whenever. But this is ahead of the final matches in a double game week 28, ahead of another double game week in 29. So that's why I was mentioning about Reece James. He, in this particular week, got 18 points in his first game, and now he's injured for the second one. So that's a particular decision there. You mentioned that FPL managers have high levels of information literacy. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so part of my job is teaching students information literacy skills. So this is quite simple stuff about where to find information, but how to conduct research, how to assess which type of information is good information or not, whether things are reliable or not. And I think we all do this, but sometimes people struggle with this, and that's where you see things like people believing fake news, all that sort of stuff. So it's really important to teach that. But what I find is that because of the competitive elements of fantasy football and FPL, the people who play this game naturally do these things anyway. So, and the community helps with that. So people will disbelieve a rumour maybe if it started sort of 30 minutes before the deadline, unless it's been corroborated by someone who's a valued source. People naturally do things that we teach in academia all the time. So in research, triangulation is a thing. So using qualitative methods alongside quantitative methods. FPL managers do that all the time when they use the eye test and use stats to back it up, or vice versa. So these sorts of skills that are sort of taught in academia and taught as the best ways to research, we see examples of FPL managers doing this every day without even thinking about it or reflecting on it. So, and we can see that there are lots of managers like yourself who have a great history. So, you obviously have high information literacy skills, because FPL is a game of research at the end of the day.
That's fascinating. FPL is a game of research. So I mean, you mentioned about your own career history. We'll come to that shortly, and that would mirror so many other people's thoughts, in my own included, where as soon as you encounter the content, the trusted sources, suddenly your rank improves because your ability to your high level of information literacy improves. For me, it was back in the days, it was just Fantasy Football Scout. That was pretty much the only one. It was the articles there, and that's obviously still the trusted source for me over the years. But obviously, there's just so much more now. But you were saying about the important skills to do with refining huge amounts of data into decisions. So you mentioned a couple of ways of doing that. Sort of understanding your own decisions, so doing a list, then sort of going back to it. But also Twitter lists and those types of things. I know we've had FPL General on the show, and he uses the watch list function on FPL.
Yeah, that's a great example. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, what other examples did you find of that really, where we're FPL managers are good at refining huge amounts of data we're all receiving?
Well, one of the interesting findings was that I interviewed a couple of content creators and a few people who kind of dabbled in content. And what they all said was that creating content in itself helps them to be a better FPL manager. So I think you said that, and some of the other people said that if you're creating content and you have to go on a podcast and talk about it, or you need to write an article, you need to be sure about what you're going to say, right? So, you'll make notes, you'll look through the stats, you'll have a process, and then that kind of does the work for you, so that when you come to make your decision, it's already there, it's already written down, it's already systematized. I spoke to someone who said he used to do a podcast, but now he's not had time so much anymore. And he said his FPL rank has gone down since he stopped doing the podcast, because he said he had to come onto the podcast and discuss with his friend and sort of justify his decisions. And since he stopped having to do that, there's a sort of a level of accountability that's gone away. So he's more likely to make silly decisions, maybe. So obviously not everyone can make content, but I think this is something that I do. I just post my team every week on Twitter. And I think even that has a certain level of accountability. I think it would stop me from doing something stupid.
I think it does. I hear that all the time. Just simply by making a comment on Fantasy Football Scout or going on Twitter or Reddit or whatever, and you feel you've committed yourself. So if you, it's an example last week. Earlier in the week was going, why are people getting rid of Cancelo? Well, now I could have held myself to that level of accountability, but I ended up wildcarding him out because I disseminated information. I decided I would get more points from other players over the next few weeks, but I hadn't come to that conclusion before because going. So, but I see that all the time, and there will be other FPL managers who will have made that bold statement, and they just feel they have to stick with it because they've sort of said it. Is that what we're talking about there, that accountability?
Definitely. I think accountability is important, but I think what for me makes the big difference is there's all sorts of different things that makes an FPL manager good or not. But when I'm teaching students how to do research and where to search to find information, I mean, obviously you need to know where to look, but once you know that, the most important thing is to have a system and record what you're doing. So record where you're searching, be systematic about it. That's the main thing that I would always tell to a student of how to find information. And I think it's the same with FPL. And I think we see with the best managers have some sort of system, have some sort of process. And I think that's why we see, obviously, content creators are content creators because they're good managers, but I also think they're good managers because they're content creators.
I think I saw someone on Twitter the other day was saying that they, a similar point I was making about simply copying teams, and they're obsessed with people's rank all the time. What's your rank? And if they said, oh, my rank's really good, they'd listen to them. And if they said the rank's not so good, they just wouldn't. And they're putting that within sort of content creating as well. So, but sometimes the best content creators haven't got the best rank, and sometimes the worst content creators have a really good rank. It's the ability to convey thoughts across in a particular medium, written word, audio, visual, whichever. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
But as you said, the two just become intertwined. It's just a byproduct of each other because you're just doing the research. But
Yeah.
that is fascinating, and I think that will be for most. As you said, not everyone is a content. It seems like everyone's a content creator, but not everyone is doing this type of thing. But they are, in a way, every time they make a comment, every time they vote in a poll, they are putting their opinion out there, and they're basing that on research. I think I've covered most of the bullet points from your that you gave over to me about the research, about the the efficiency in information gathering and having a process as well. But it was then, before we move on to your sort of career history and the next game week decision as a sort of snapshot, what was there anything else you wanted to mention specifically about your research?
Yeah, one thing I want to do is just thank everyone who took part in it. I'm not someone who has a big Twitter following. I only set up my Twitter account for the research, basically. I don't have many followers or anything like that. So I really want to thank everyone who shared my survey and took part in my interviews. I managed to chat to people around the world, so people in Nigeria and in Indonesia and things like this. So it's been really great to connect with the people in the community. So just thanks very much for that.
Wow, that's good. Let's have a look at your career history, because as you said, we can sort of see when you became involved. So back from 2013, you became involved, obviously, sub 300k, sub 200k the year after, sub 200k again, getting closer, 100k, just over 100k, then dipping out again, 400k, and then 18,000 in 2018. And then a bit dipped out again, about just under 500,000, and then top 50k. And now this season, as we'll come to, you're also top 50k currently. So we can see a pattern here. So people might look at this and go, why have we got this guy on? Look at this. But you can see the pattern here. You're doing exactly what we've all done. We've all consumed information. And then you've done it in a more systematic and better way. So is that a fair assumption? 2018, was that when you started to...
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, guess which year I discovered Fantasy Football Scout, right?
Yeah.
I always played FPL, and I sort of took it regularly fairly seriously. I was in a mini league with my friends that I'm still in, and I was trying to win the mini league. I didn't really pay any attention to what rank I was at all. And I think it probably just started like Googling fantasy football tips, and I found Fantasy Football Scout, and I sort of didn't look back from there. I sort of gradually got more involved, and then ended up creating a Twitter account, and now I spend quite a lot of my time watching YouTube videos, things like that. So I'm still not a great FPL manager like some of the people who've been on this series before, but I think you can see that there's a big difference in my history, and that big difference is not really down to my ability or my strategies or anything like that. It's simply because I found better information.
Yeah, I mean that's the point. That's the point of Meet the Manager. It's morphed over the years, and this is what we're interested in. It's sort of how we think as FPL managers and how we can improve. So the rank issue is almost irrelevant. It's just a happy coincidence. In your case, it proves exactly what you were talking about. So 2018-19. So that was also the sort of start, really, of the proliferation of Twitter and Reddit as involving quite trusted sources of information, but also Fantasy Football Scout there as well. So what else sort of over the last year or so has influenced the way that you make decisions, and rather has influenced the way you make good decisions?
I'm not sure, really. I think I watch more content now than ever before. I think a lot of the people I talked to in my research actually said that COVID was a big factor that sort of radicalised them as an FPL manager, really. And that was certainly the case for me. I used to sort of dip in and out of it. But when we were sort of in lockdown, there wasn't much else to do. I've sort of spend a lot more time now consuming videos. I watch the Scoutcast every week. I watch Black Box, all those sorts of things. And I think what has It's funny in a way because I think sometimes I make decisions. I am more influenced by the community now than I was before, and obviously that has some benefits, but there's some downsides to it as well. I think sometimes in the past maybe there were decisions that I would have made that came off that I just wouldn't do anymore. I think I'm more influenced by stats now than I was before. Before I discovered Fantasy Football Scout, for example, I was like completely just the eye test. I didn't really know what stats were. So I'm more influenced by stats now, more influenced by the content I create, really. I consume, sorry. So what is the difference? I think the difference is I'm just consuming more information and from more trusted sources. I think the information that the community is generating now is just really good. So yeah, I think that's it really. Just I've got more access to stats, more access to good opinions from other people.
Okay, well let's have a look at your Gameweek 29 team. So we're about to head up to that deadline. So this video will go out just before that, but I do hope that people watch this afterwards as well. And this is purely a snapshot here. So we're looking at your team. You're currently in the top 50k, and you potentially currently within this Gameweek 28. You've still got 8 to go, including your captain, who I think is Coutinho. I think I saw. And so the final match of Gameweek 28. So this is Gameweek 29 we're looking at. So we're already looking ahead to that. So you captained Coutinho, as we just said. You bench boosted last week, Gameweek 28. You wildcarded in Gameweek 26, and you free hit in Gameweek 27. Now that's the overall strategy. Before we list the players in your team, that overall strategy was quite a sort of Twitter hive mind. I mean that what I've just described, your strategy there is a strategy that is working for people, and that is one that is from. Yeah, where did you get that from?
Maybe this is me sort of exhibiting the sort of quality that I found in other people. I sort of feel like I didn't just copy what everyone else on Twitter was doing. I looked at my squad in Gameweek 26 when the new fix just came out and sort of built a wildcard squad and was like, this looks really good. I can sort of cover quite a lot of weeks from here on with these chips. And sort of did that and then like logged onto Twitter and everyone else had done the same thing. But I think it kind of made sense. I'm not actually sure it was the correct decision now. My Game Week 26 team before the wild card would have done a few points better. And I think and this week has been good, so I'm happy with this week, and then I guess next week will be the real test of whether it's been a good strategy or not. But I'm sort of quite happy so far. I was very happy with my Coutinho captaincy paying off.
Well, I'll just read out your team for the benefit of those listening to the podcast version, and then we'll sort of go through them and see where we are. So you've got Game Week 29, got Ramsdale in goal, Robertson, Alexander-Arnold, Ben White, all have doubles, and you've also got Luca Dean in there. Coutinho, Salah. This is the triple captaincy chip. This is probably why you said you didn't do so well in Game Week 26, because those that didn't wildcard could play their triple captaincy there for his Salah's points, and there would have been a rank drop for anyone who didn't triple captain him there. Rafinha, Saka, double game week. Brozier, Kane, your vice captain, won't need him, but as vice captain. But yeah, double game week. Manchester United and Brighton he plays. And then on your bench you got Foster, Jimenez, Sace, and Ramsey. So a good bench as well. You know, a great setup there. You mentioned you might have made a mistake in terms of game week 26, didn't you? But that's just one game week. How do you think this team will fare? In the weeks to come. I mean, I'd be surprised if it doesn't do very well this week with triple captaincy on Salah. But I'm pretty confident this week and next week as well. I'll have 11 players out next week, like barring injuries. Looking ahead, like if you look at the fixture ticker, like 30 to 38, I think it's still looking okay. I think that sort of Arsenal have good fixtures. I've got 3 Arsenal. I'm planning on getting more Spurs players in. They have, good fixtures going forward. So
although I think people who've still got the wild card in the pocket have got an advantage because they're going to be able to attack those fixtures better than I am. I'm still pretty confident that the team's in good shape. So, yeah, happy as it goes.
When I do the notes for the Scoutcast each week, I have to constantly bring myself back to the game week in hand because I'm already thinking about the next game week at the expense of the current game week. But I'm already so this week I managed to get away with it by doing some game week 30 stats, and I'm already thinking that far in ahead as well. How far do you think? So for example, thinking ahead, some of those players will become Leicester players, and they could become Everton or Burnley players because they have more fixtures. So the reason I mentioned those 3 times, the tidal wave of information, the tsunami that is going to come through each week by Friday. If Leicester have a double game week, you'll think, oh, I think I could get Harvey Barnes, Jamie Vardy, Maddison. But if there's a double game week for Everton or Burnley, who are doing less well and are less exciting players, you already shook your head. But how do you think your decision will be when Burnley have 2 double game weeks in a row? Will you actually have a Burnley player in your team?
I've kind of been burned by these sort of bad clubs with double game weeks already. My Burnley assets that I had on my free hit were bad. I had Gray earlier on when Everton had a double game week, and they just didn't really work out. And I think I've learned my lesson that I think every week coming forward is pretty much going to be a double game week or most game weeks. And it's probably best not to chase each week and sort of try and get in an Everton player and a Burnley player because they don't always work out. Just because they've got 2 games doesn't mean that they're actually going to be good shouts. So I'm going to, unless some of them start coming into form, I'm going to be avoiding those type of clubs if I can.
I was listening to the Planet FPL, James and Suj on Az's Black Box show, and there was a good piece of advice there about, do I want that player? Can I stand looking at that player in my team over a number of weeks? And Everton and Burnley players perhaps don't fall into that category. Players you want to look at lots. But I just find it interesting with your team here. So you've got fully stacked on Arsenal, Liverpool. They're sort of your base there. What about Chelsea going forward? So Rudiger, James could be back. Mason Mount, Havertz. What are they going to find a way into your team? Do you think?
I think they will, but it'll be after 30 now. Obviously, I think. I've got a couple of different ways of going at the moment. So do I want to get Son in as well as Kane? I think that's my current thing. Or can Kulusevski cover him? That's kind of what I'm thinking at the moment. But yeah, eventually I'm going to have a Chelsea defender. I think I've been quite lucky that James appears to be injured now because he really punished me this week. But the way my team was set up, I didn't really think that it would work. I would have to get rid of Robertson. He's got a double this week. So I'm happy with the situation as it is now. I can keep Robertson. But yeah, after game week 30, I'm going to be looking at Chelsea. Although we've heard news about the situation at Chelsea today, I don't know whether that's going to affect the way things are on the pitch. Probably not for a while. But
just to timestamp this, so people will be watching this in a year's time, going, "What are they talking about?" This is the decision from a year ago, which is today, where the government is cracking down on various Russian sources of money to do with the Ukraine conflict, and one of those is Roman Abramovich. So that we don't know, what effect that will have in terms of our decisions as FPL managers or what's going to happen on the pitch. So it's a bit unknown at the moment, but financially there's some issues going on there. That's what we're talking about in a year's time. If you see this in a year's time, it's interesting you bring that up though, because with COVID, with situations like ownership of clubs, with situations around certain players who might find themselves falling foul of the law, these are all sort of outside of actual footballing decisions, actually what's happening on the pitch. To what extent does that information, I'm a journalist, so I obviously look at those types of things, but not everyone does. But do you think that increasingly FPL managers are having to become more sort of news aware?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the COVID thing has been a big one this year for that. So we need to be aware of you know, where there are COVID outbreaks, what the regulations are. So I think earlier on this year there were a lot of games that were impacted by the COVID regulations, meaning that if a player hadn't been vaccinated and someone else in the team had COVID, they would need to isolate as well. So I think there are all. I think there's probably been more than ever before this year, but I think it's going to continue to be a thing that FPL managers are going to look at. And I think also as well, the FPL community just has more capacity now. There's more people involved. There are more people with different expertise that are able to help with these sorts of things. So I think that is something that we're going to start to see more of. And it's just another way to get an edge, right? Yeah. If we can find out some news that is maybe going to affect the way someone plays on the pitch, then I think FPL managers are really motivated to get that, and they've got the capacity to find the information.
Fascinating. I just linked in with that as well. Something I noticed when I was watching the live feed of a particular BBC, was rolling commentary, and the journalist involved kept mentioning his fantasy football team. So and so, whatever, got injured, got scored. That's good, bad for my fantasy team. I'm seeing that. I'm hearing that much more on radio. I'm seeing that much more. And those sorts of decisions. So I call it the fantasification of football. But will that also help influence the way that we consume information when we become mainstream?
I think so, yeah, and I think you're already starting to see that. I think it'll start to become more part of the media, and that they'll discuss this. I think on BT already they sometimes discuss like fantasy football points for players as well alongside scores. I think FPL's growing all the time, and I think there's just more of a demand for that kind of content. So we're going to start to see in mainstream broadcasts and mainstream publications as well. And I think what that will only do is make the hardcore players even more motivated to seek out that advantage over the more casual player. Okay. If everyone's got that sort of basic level information and they're getting it through the TV, then we need to go that extra bit further, right, to make sure that we get ahead of the casuals.
This has been a fascinating chat. I'm so pleased that you managed to find time for this. I think it's been really good because a lot of the points FPL managers will be aware of, but it's getting that sort of honed down into what you've just described, and someone like you actually doing the legwork, doing the research into this to find out how we think as FPL managers. And I found it absolutely fascinating that the success that we're all having as FPL managers, not in terms of our own ranks, but in terms of the success we're having in using information, is something that other people and other sectors can learn from as well. I found that fascinating. But just before we go, Dan, was there anything else you wanted to mention as well, just before we say our goodbyes?
No, just again, thanks to everyone who's helped out with the research. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm FPL Tika. But yeah, just thanks everyone for tuning in.
Brilliant, excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time. It's been a great chat, and good luck with the game week. Good luck with your season, and good luck with your seasons to come, disseminating that information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.